Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the America East Spread Respect Forum. We are thrilled to have our final panel of the afternoon. So thanks for those that have attended. Hopefully you found that the networking session that preceded this was valuable to get the chance to talk to one another, talk a little bit about your labels. I am going to waste no time here and turn things over to our moderator in just a second. I want to remind everybody that the best way for you to engage with us is to use this question and answer section as a part of your HOVA platform. You can also use the chat if you want to make comments, that you want our panelists to hear from, or you hear the other attendees. But please use the Q&A as much as possible. We'd love to share your questions with the group as we move through today's conversation. So with that, I am going to queue up our next session. So this is going to be a session moderated by Valerie Moyer. Val is a member of our America East team. We're excited to have her. She's a former America East student athlete herself, so big shout out to Vermont Track and Field. Val is currently finishing up her PhD work at Stony Brook University, soon to be a Doctor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Study. And Val is currently working directly on our academic consortium and the initiatives that are coming out of the consortium these days. So Val, really excited to have you. I'm going to turn things over to you for you to get introduce our panelists and get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. I'm really excited about this conversation. So as I introduce our panelists, maybe if you could just give us a wave on screen so we know who is who. So today with us, we have Kathy Zurlott. Kathy was hired at UMBC in the fall of 1972 to upgrade the fledgling volleyball and women's lacrosse squads. Zurlott had just earned her bachelor's and master's degrees from Frostburg State after competing in lacrosse, basketball, and field hockey for the Bobcats. After a total rebuilding of the lacrosse program, her 1984 team won the ECAC Division II title, and the 1985 and 86 squads were ranked #1 in the nation, earning their mentor USWLA Coach of the Year honors. In total, the UMBC Athletic Hall of Famer coached 850 intercollegiate contests. Since the mid-1990s, Kathy has served as UMBC's athletics SWA and its compliance officer. Among her wide array of appointments, she was selected to serve on the prestigious NCAA Council and chaired the NCAA Women's Lacrosse Championships Committee. Kathy is just one of 10 UMBC employees, past or present, to complete 41 years of service to the university. So we're really happy to have her with us today to talk about Title IX. And then our next panelist is Dr. Amira Rose Davis, who is an assistant professor of history and African American studies at Penn State University, where she specializes in 20th century American history with an emphasis on race, gender, sports, and politics. She is currently the 2021-2022 Harrington Faculty Fellow at the University of Texas, Austin, where she's finishing up her book titled "Can't Eat a Medal: The Lives and Labors of Black Women Athletes in the Age of Jim Crow," which will be distributed by UNC Press. Her work has appeared in scholarly journals, including the Radical History Review, Journal of African American History, and Modern American History, as well as popular outlets such as the Washington Post and Slate. Recently named a Mellon Emerging Faculty Leader by the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, Davis also provides sports commentary for venues such as NPR, ESPN, and BBC, and serves on the advisory board of the Jackie Robinson Museum and the Arthur Ashe Legacy Foundation. Davis is also the co-host of the feminist sports podcast, Burn It All Down, and the host of season 3 of American Prodigies, both on the Blue Wire podcast network. Great, so welcome, Amira. And last but very not least, we have Tara Balinsky, who's a graduate of the University at Albany, where she majored in communications and minored in sociology. She received her master's degree at the University at Albany in communications with an emphasis on organizational communication. During her time at UAlbany, Tara competed for the women's track and field team, where she won 8 America East team titles, 3 individual titles in the shot put, and was named the 2019 America East Woman of the Year. Tara is entering her 4th season with the New York Football Giants as the manager of community relations and youth football. And over the last 2 years, the New York Giants have grown the game of high school girls flag football in New York and New Jersey with the hope of it becoming a sanctioned sport in the coming years. So it's super exciting, and we're going to hear more about that today. So before we go into our conversation, we wanted to start by playing a video essay by Dr. Davis, which aired before the championship game of the Women's March Madness basketball tournament. So thank you to Amira for sharing this with us, and we think it provides a really nice backdrop for this conversation.
I'm going to be honest, it's nearly impossible to sit here on this very stage, one of the biggest in all of women's sports, and not reflect on the pioneers and, frankly, legislation that got us to this point. This year's the 50th anniversary of Title IX, a 37-word statute that aimed to regulate rampant discrimination against women. And while we celebrate the advancements and accomplishments Title IX has brought, Dr. Amira Rose Davis notes that the path to true equity has miles to go.
How do you measure 50 years? In the wins? In the number of obstacles you've overcome? The distance still to go? How can 50 years feel like a world away and yesterday, all at the same time? 50 years ago, women took to the street, to the courthouse, to the courts, to fight for gender equality. 50 years ago, women couldn't serve on a jury, couldn't have a mortgage or credit card in their name. Women could be legally fired for getting pregnant or calling out sexual harassment. There were outright bans on athletic participation. What is so threatening about a woman running?
Remember that.
I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks.
50 years ago, trailblazers fought like hell for Title IX, for legal protections, for access, for opportunity. But Title IX is a Band-Aid. Its 37 words changed the game, but did not heal the wound. Title IX was not initially about sports, but athletics became the playground of projections and ideas about equality. And through sports, we have measured progress for women.
Venus Williams has become the highest paid woman athlete in the world, signed a $40 million endorsement deal with Reebok.
Go! The United States has won the Women's World Cup.
50 years may seem distant, but these battles are familiar.
Despite all the wins, I'm still paid less than men who do the same job that I do. And I've been told that I don't deserve any more than less because I am a woman.
We still fight for equal pay, for pregnancy protections, for resources.
Let me show y'all the men's weight room.
We still fight for access, for inclusion, to be believed. We still fight for safety.
I don't want another young gymnast or any individual to experience the horror that I endured.
We still fight to wear what we want, for opportunity, for authenticity, for ourselves.
It's our destiny, know what we stand for.
Still, always, onward.
We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation.
This generation has been forged in fire. They are taking the torch and are ready to burn it all down, to blaze their own trail. Your categories cannot contain you. Your expectations are not their limit. underestimate them at your own peril.
How did she do that?
How foolish to deny yourself their greatness. They have the ball in their court, the next 50 on their mind. They got next, so watch out.
Great. So I think that's a great introduction to what we're kind of going to talk about today. And I wanted to turn it over to you, Amira, to kind of go back through and give us a brief overview of Title IX and how it came to be passed as a piece of legislation and what it does or doesn't do in practice.
Absolutely. Thank y'all for being here today. So happy to have this wonderful conversation with this tremendous panel. Title IX is something invoked often, but is very vague, and some of that's intentional. The legislation first was drafted in the early 70s. It came on the heels of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That Civil Rights Act, of course, was hard fought by civil rights activists and included provisions for making sure that there was no discrimination on the basis of color, creed, national origin. But sex was not included in that 1964 Civil Rights Act, particularly around public accommodations and entities receiving federal funds. And so many people, led by a lot of feminists, but also joined in, especially by civil rights activists, especially Black women who had been fighting both battles, started lobbying to get sex included in those protections. And that really became the foundation of the push for what we now know as Title IX. Now, as you heard in the video essay, it's 37 words. No person in the United States shall, based on sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. How can 37 words have such an impact? Well, one of the reasons is it has broad applicability. And we now know, and the conversation that we'll have today really centers it around athletics, but it was not originally, included in fact, as that legislation was passed in the early 70s, there was a lot of people who suddenly woke up and was like, oh my gosh, is this going to apply to athletics? And there's actually a concentrated effort called the Tower Amendment to say, yeah, Title IX is cool, but we're not going to apply it to athletics. Don't touch our football scholarships. Just ignore that part of the federal programming. And when that Tower Amendment was defeated in the mid 70s, it officially ushered in a period of time in which that clause about discrimination was applied to athletics. And this is largely what we point to when we talk about the numbers of doors that legislation opened, because it mandated more opportunities for girls and women in high schools and colleges, right? Federally funded ones, of course. And so you can already start seeing some of the limitations. What we're seeing now is we have multiple generations who have grown up under Title IX, who have always had access to play in various ways. And then that stops. There's no Title IX for professional leagues, right? So one of the things we see there is a bottleneck. We've also seen how this legislation has ebbed and flowed over the years. And so about a decade plus ago, we saw under Barack Obama's presidency explicitly, moving to say LGBTQ, sex discrimination, sexual harassment falls under these understandings of sex discrimination, right? So if you're harassed, that's a denial of equal education access, which is why you might also hear of Title IX in conversations related to sexual assault or sexual harassment, especially on college campuses is where you hear a lot about that. And so one of the reasons that we're dealing with Title IX in the way that we are right now is because that enforcement of that, how you monitor that, right, is where you get a lot of gray area, a lot of vagueness. Of course, you have 37 words. That's a lot of work for 37 words to do. And so I invite us to think about what Title IX says, right? How it's been understood, how it's been applied, and where the battles are for its continued application. We see this every year. There is, especially under the last administration, got like 2 months before this collegiate school year started, new Title IX provisions that were so dense and intentionally vague that it made it very hard to even think about how you would monitor enforcement. And so as I kind of conclude these opening remarks, I think that part of the conversation really has shifted to how is this applied, right? There's 3 traditional ways in which schools can fall under Title IX compliance, right? You can demonstrate that you have opportunities, you can say you're working towards it, you can make sure that they're proportional, or that there's a need, like that people are asking for leagues. And these have been the traditional models of how we look at that. And we can start seeing these gaps, these vagaries popping up around this legislation. And when we see people not enforcing it or figuring out how to avoid enforcing it. We'll talk later about March Madness last year, for instance, and a lot of people last year said, oh, isn't Title IX applied here? Isn't Title IX applied to the NCAA postseason? And I think that's like a really great example to sum up a lot of what I've just said, in which people know enough to go and say, Title IX should be working here. But the NCAA, despite getting a lot of federal money, right, is not under it because they literally sued in the 90s to say that it doesn't apply to them, even though it applies to their member programs. And that's how you get the atrocity that we saw last year at the March Madness tournament. Well, it wasn't able to be called March Madness last year, but at the women's postseason tournament, not falling under the purview of Title IX, even if it hits on extreme gender inequity. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about the legislation.
Thank you for that, for giving us a historical overview. And I wanted to turn it over to Kathy now to talk about what that looked like in practice from the inside of an athletic department. So Kathy, when you retired in 2014, you'd been a part of UMBC athletics for 41 years. And you'd arrived on campus just a year after the Title IX legislation was passed. And you've since kind of become recognized as the voice of women's sports at UMBC. So can you talk a little bit about kind of that transformation and how you were involved in pushing this forward in practice on campus?
Yeah, I mean, when I arrived there, yes, the legislation had just passed. My athletic director, I don't think he knew it even passed. You know, women's sports at that point, we didn't have a national organization. The AIAW hadn't happened yet either. You know, I remember we're playing on a field by the library, and my lacrosse team is wearing my volleyball jerseys because I also coached volleyball, and the field hockey kilts. Men are playing lacrosse in the stadium with a nice locker room. You know, they're traveling on buses, we're traveling on vans. Of course, most of our opponents were local, and when the Title IX group came on campus, because we had a gentleman who followed us and Loyola and Towson, we did answer some suits in the early going, which was interesting because, as Amira was saying about, you know, Title IX was about access. Well, the people who came on campus, they had been used to dealing with access for like handicapped people. So the first suit was very interesting because they really didn't know what they were looking at, to be honest with you. I sat in a room with them and they said, well, there's an obvious problem. You have 50 helmets in men's lacrosse and 3 helmets in women's lacrosse. And I went, okay, first off, the games are just named the same, you know, and I had to explain why that existed, why that was not inequitable. It was what the rules were. they had some other ideas that we were like, that's not really Title IX. You know, we want to talk about locker rooms. We want to talk about the women playing basketball in the same place the men were. But that wasn't even talked about. That was not talked about at all in those suits. We didn't play in the same gym. Volleyball and basketball played in what was called Gym 1. The field house had just opened. The men were playing over there. It took several years of us to push that volleyball should be over there and basketball should be over there. Of course, then they had to create locker rooms for us, which they didn't have at that point. Eventually, I got my women's lacrosse team down to the stadium. Took a while. We didn't have locker rooms down there. We had to dress in the field house. We used the volleyball locker room in the spring for lacrosse. The last 24 years of my time at UMBC, we had a gentleman come in as athletic director, Dr. Charles Brown. And he has a very athletic wife and 2 very athletic daughters. And the first thing he did, sitting down with me, looking at the figures and all, he said, we got a problem. We are not in compliance. And I said, I've been telling them that for some time, but no one's listening. He says, well, I'm listening. So at that point, we really started making changes at UMBC. And of course, by then the NCAA had decided, hey, you know, maybe we should take over women's sports and put them under our umbrella. But, you know, I saw several differences. I wasn't being paid the same as my equal. It took a couple of years because at a state institution, you just can't throw a big salary advance. So it took a couple of years, but he eventually got me to equal pay with my partner. It took a lot of raising money on our own to get facilities for our athletes. And I used to laugh at him because, of course, when he came in, I was doing 2 sports, no assistant coaches, all the compliance issues, no help there either. So we got me out of volleyball, and then we eventually got me out of lacrosse. But I would laugh because I said, good, you replace me with a coach, they get assistants, and they get scholarships. You know? It took a while to do that, but eventually we got it done. And we added women's sports. We added softball, which we did not have. We added women's soccer, which we did not have. So I think when I retired, UMBC was in a much better place. Is it where it has to be? No, I don't think there's a university that can say that it's exactly where it should be. I don't think that happens. I mean, I'm seeing better leadership. I'm seeing, well, they just changed presidents. We had a great president, Freeman Hrabowski, but we also look like we've got a great one coming in. Dr. Ashley, she's a minority woman coming from Duke University. I see Penn State is losing Sandy Barber, though. She's retiring. So that's another female icon that we're losing. So it's nice, though, to see that we now have some women in administrative positions. Do we have enough? No.
Yeah.
Do we have enough representation of minority students in all of our sports? No. Women's lacrosse lags behind, but it's getting better. The woman that I was honored with, she is not only a judge, but she's extremely active in the promotion of women's lacrosse for minorities, which, you know, is badly needed.
I hope we can come back to that a little bit, but I wanted to turn it over to Tara just to talk about your experience kind of far after Title IX. So in 2019, you were honored as the America East Woman of the Year, which is obviously a recognition of your athletic accomplishments, but also academic dedication and service to the community. And so sports has been such a big part of your personal and professional journey. And could I get you to talk about what that means for you and how Title IX has impacted you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to start, the Woman of the Year recognition was the highlight of my college career. I think it was a true testament to the support that Albany gave me through my teammates, my coaches, the support staff, but also the administration. And I was fortunate enough to be on the track and field team where my coaches really understood how important academics were and how important it was for me to be in the community. So if there were times where I had a conflict, whether it was undergrad or grad school, they were very accommodating and understood that there's life after sport when it comes to your NCAA career. And I wasn't going to be throwing a shot put for a living as much as I would have loved to. I don't know how much my body could have handled the lifting, but it definitely was something I couldn't have done without the support from the university. But also it took me a few years to understand the platform that I had as a student athlete. And SAC really helped me understand that being a student athlete, you are pretty much idolized by the community that you play in. So being in the city of Albany, the capital of New York State, there are so many elementary schools, high schools, middle schools that surrounded us. And we were able to do our best to get out into the community, meet with those kids face to face, meet with the educators, their parents, and just show them that no matter what you're going through in your life, whatever struggles are being thrown at you, through perseverance and surrounding yourself with people that want you to excel, you can achieve the goals that you want. And being out in the community with SAC kind of sparked something in me where I was like, I really love doing this. And if there's a way that I can do this as a career, like sign me up right away. So through the help with the America East and networking with Albany, I was able to, get my resume in the hands of some people with the New York Giants, went through the interview process there and started as a full season intern right when I graduated. And as soon as I got there, I was in awe of the organization, the family atmosphere, but also very fortunate to still feel part of a team. There's still a competitive aspect when you're working for a professional sports team. We want to perform the best on the field. But for me and my team, we want to do the best that we can in the community. So I think in terms of Title IX, it's afforded me the opportunity to participate in athletics, which has allowed me to network with people, create lifelong friendships, and understand that when you have a true support system behind you, there are going to be times where you think that you can't take a step forward because you're exhausted, you don't know your left from right. But as long as you have people supporting you, they'll take you in the right direction. And I'm very fortunate to be able to continue the impact on the community through sports. And I look forward to doing that for the rest of my career. But sports was with me as a child, it was with me as a teenager, it's with me now, it'll be with me for the rest of my life. And I'm very fortunate to still use that platform.
That's great. Thanks for sharing your story with us a little bit. So I wanted to go back a little bit and kind of touch on what, Kathy, you were nodding to, but sometimes when we talk about Title IX, we don't talk about the negative or disruptive aspects of the legislation or that intersection of gender and race historically. So I was wondering if, Amira, you could talk a little bit about the impact Title IX had on athletic opportunities for Black women.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I talk about Title IX, I usually say like the good, the bad, and the ugly. And oftentimes in conversations, we get really stuck on the good. And if we think about this legislation as a foundation, then we need to know where the kind of cracks in that foundation are so we can stabilize it moving forward. And so to that end, I think it's important to note that Title IX was not the beginning of women's sports. There were robust sporting cultures before the 70s, in particularly in historically Black colleges and universities, which were one of the only places you could get a scholarship before Title IX if you were a woman, and you could do that starting in the 1920s. There were a lot of enclaves of like recent ethnic immigrant groups that supported athletics. And a lot of times this was about class politics, it was about racial and ethnic politics, right? That there's a little bit more permissibility around being athletic, around the idea of having glory or being able to bring glory to your ethnicity or your race, et cetera, through athletics, which opened up the ability and the infrastructure to play and to compete. And so you see this very clearly, for instance, with Black women in track and field, where they had some of the earliest running opportunities. And so much so that when you get to the 1948 Olympics, for instance, of the 12 women on the US national track team, 9 of them are Black girls from HBCUs in the American South. And that's going to hold for a very long time. And so what happens when, and we're familiar with this with Black college football, right? That after integration, the dominant programs in football that had been at these Black schools were rated, people were not able to sustain and recruit from bigger, now integrated, newly integrated schools. For women, the same thing happens after Title IX, right? And so after it's mandated that you need to have these opportunities for women, I talked to the late Coach Temple, who had a storied program at Tennessee State University, coach of Wilma Rudolph, and many Tiger Bells, so many Olympic medals. He said, I can't recruit against the University of Tennessee. I can't sustain that any longer. And so Title IX actually spells the end of dominance for these really historical programs, the end of a lot of opportunities in that regard. It also introduces just class in a different way. So a lot of times now that there's infrastructure around it, and as we know, if you're familiar with youth sports now, there's a lot of pay to play that starts happening. And so accessing sport is also something that becomes harder. I think that when we look at the legislation and we talk about growth, it's important to note what sports are growing. And we know that the sports with the biggest gains, field hockey, lacrosse, swimming, golf, are also the sports that have the least amount of diversity in them. And so it's not a kind of random question, it's actually a really necessary question to ask. For who did Title IX benefit immediately, and who's still fighting, and we're all fighting in many ways, but I think that that's really important, right? Because Black women athletes are overrepresented in track, in basketball, overrepresented, but statistically, statistics speak for that. The only other sport that's hit double-digit numbers of participation is volleyball, and that's recent, and that's up to 11%. Every other sport, we're talking about less than 5%, 3%, 2%, 0.5% representation, and those are the sports that tend to have the most growth patterns that we're seeing. And so that's something that we can continue to track. And that's what I characterize as the area that we need to do a lot of work in. Similarly, and I think this will help transition us to talking about the ways that we can hope for, or where we're identifying pushes for future kind of equity solutions, et cetera, is a conversation that Kathy already kind of brought up in terms of administration and coaching. At the time Title IX passed, over 90% of coaches of women's sports were women, and that number is now under 50% today. Administrators, 90% at the time of Title IX of women's college sports, for instance. By 1990, that had fallen to 15.9%, 15.9%. And that remains a struggle. We have great data recently out of the Global Sports Institute that shows us that the women who are now breaking those ceilings, my friend Candace Lee at Vanderbilt, Carla Williams, of course, at UVA, getting these women getting into the Power Five. We've seen on end that women in administrative levels have had playing experience, often coaching experience, have had a higher level of advanced degrees. In fact, Black women coaches and administrators oftentimes are holding PhDs at a percentage that's like not even nobody else, right, is doing this. In fact, since Title IX, we know that the biggest beneficiaries of it, if we look at who's gotten the most jobs, who gets the most second chances, right, have been white men. And that statistic really runs headfirst into what we think we know about this legislation. But the reality is that as it becomes institutionalized, those pioneers, those trailblazers start getting pushed out because it becomes a job, right, that now people are thinking about. And I think you mentioned before the NCAA, and I think it's a great way to look at it is looking at the AIAW, which organized and governed women's sports. And the NCAA said, we want absolutely nothing to do with women's sports, and actually sued multiple times to have nothing to do with women's sports. And once they lost that lawsuit multiple times and realized begrudgingly that they had to deal with women's sports, they proceeded to absolutely demolish the AIAW, wrested control of women's sports from them. You had 1 year overlap where they both offered a postseason tournament, and that was it. And so now when we're talking about the NCAA and we're talking about where these gaps are, whatever, we have to remember we're dealing with an institution that tried for many years to have nothing to do with the product that they now are ignoring or pretending to care about. And so I think that these are helpful ways of thinking about it instead of like a heavily romantic, look what Title IX has done. I think if we can start by saying, this is what has changed because of Title IX. And that point of the conversation, this is what has changed, allows us to track what has changed in terms of increasing access and opportunity, and what has changed in limiting it. And I think we can see limitations in terms of the racial disparities, the class disparities, the gender disparities in terms of coaching and administrating positions. And that gets at a much larger picture of the ecosystem of sports and the gaps that we're still talking about when we're addressing the inadequacies of, or the kind of places what we still need to push the legislation to reach.
Yeah. So with that, I want to turn it back over to Tara and Kathy and ask you to, what do you see as the shortcomings of Title IX, and where would you like to see this go in terms of the future, working towards more equity for all women?
Yeah, I can jump in there. I think to Amira and both Kathy's point, there have been issues for years and years and years that haven't been spoken about and haven't been on front page of newspapers, haven't been trending on Twitter, things like that. But I think what I have seen since being a student athlete and now graduating is the power of the student athlete voice and how they have transformed the game that they play for. And the first thing that comes to my mind is the women's tournament last year with Sedona, who just takes out her phone, uploads a video to TikTok. And TikTok didn't even exist when I was in college, and I graduated in 2019. So everything is so fast. And for student athletes to understand that they have that voice, they have that power, they can show those inequities and no one can suppress them from doing that. They have the power to share their own story that are facts, like video evidence that can't be thrown and said, oh, that's not really happening. This is what's happening. It's kind of hard to fight against that. So I think for me, highlighting those injustices is one thing. And I think student athletes are doing a great job, but they're also so empowered to make actual changes. So Amir referenced how people have been talking about what they want to do in sports. They've been talking about how they can help, how things are equal, but there hasn't been as much action taking place. And this year it kind of started to happen more. Like, we were at one of our girls' flag football kickoff events last Friday, I think it was. And one of the coaches was like, all right, girls, it's time to go. We got to get out of here. I want to make sure that I'm getting back for the UConn women's game and I can watch that. They're talking about getting home in time for a women's basketball game. I haven't really been in a setting where that's happened before. It's always been men's tournaments on. We got to watch UNC versus Duke, all of that. And now the women's game is being showed nationwide in prime time. People are watching it. This was the most watched women's basketball final since 2004, I think it was. So I think we're seeing now that there are issues. It's not something that's a myth, it's actually happening. So understanding that student athletes' voices are fueling action to change that is definitely empowering to know as a student athlete, and for younger student athletes to know that they're not just dribbling a basketball. They're not just shooting a lacrosse ball. Like there's so much more to them than being an athlete. Yes, they're a student, but also they're an advocate. They're a mentor. They're a role model. So I think there comes pressure with that. But if schools are able to provide adequate resources, there's such a ceiling for student athletes and the games that they play, their coaches. So I'm definitely looking forward to that. But we just got to make sure that we're providing them with the resources and the education to do so, because I know the game has also changed a lot with things like the transfer portal. Now student athletes can start making money, rightfully so, for the things that they've worked so hard for. So just maneuvering through that in a way that always keeping in mind the student athletes' health and safety first, but making sure that they're developing outside of the game. Because like I said, my coaches knew I wasn't going to be throwing shot put professionally. They knew that I had a life after sport, and they knew that I had a platform to help other people. So just making sure that the student athletes know the power that they have.
It's a good point. I think one of the other problems we're still facing in Title IX is the women's coaches, women's officials, women's administrators. And it's hard. Sometimes you want to grow those people. I mean, I've got alums that are coaching lacrosse. Some of them are actually out there in the college area coaching as head coaches. But more sticking youthful, which is good, the youth leagues and all, but we still don't have enough head coaches that are women for women's sports. I remember having an issue with our softball team where we had gone through 4 female coaches. One, wanted to start a family. One left on her own accord, which was good because she wasn't going to be long for our program due to some things that we noticed in what she was doing, and others, again, very young, no experience really, no mentorship that they grew up in and then became a head coach. These were young ladies that, okay, you were a good player, let's make you a head coach. It doesn't work out that way. We had a couple miscues in women's lacrosse for the same thing. But in softball, after having 4 head coaches, we had this one gentleman who had applied once before, he applied again, and I'm sitting there with my boss saying, okay, how are we serving our female athletes? What is the best we can do for our softball players? Are we serving them by having a total lack of consistency? We ended up hiring this guy who was living in New York and his wife was living in Annapolis, Maryland. And I said, well, he's not going to go anywhere. He wants to get down there. But it was a tough decision. Now we asked that he did hire female assistant coaches, one of which is now a head coach at a D3 program. So that was our intent. We got to help grow some of these coaches. It was good to watch Syracuse playing lacrosse yesterday, and the new head coach of Syracuse served time as an assistant coach at Boston College. So, that's what we need more of. We need to somehow get these women in this, like the old boys pipeline. We need to develop the old ladies pipeline, I guess you could say, where we have young people coming out and being mentored and then stepping into a position with experience. I know when I moved strictly into administration, a lot of my fellow female lacrosse coaches also went on to be administrators, SWAs, and then senior, the SWAs, then associates and senior administrators. I could think the Dartmouth coach became the AD there. Jane Miller at Virginia has been second in charge down there. And there's a bunch more I can think of, but those are the kind of things we need. When we first went into one conference, number one, they didn't have SWAs at the meetings. And one of the universities, the SWA was the male AD, and he couldn't understand why I had a problem with that. So there were some people that needed to be pushed forward, but I really think we need to push forward women getting into the coaching and making it possible for them to have families and still coach.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Val.
Go for it.
I really wanted to piggyback on this for a second, because pipeline is such an issue. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing is that doors are opening, but it's about where you get stuck. So I have a piece called Chutes and Ladders that I return to often because I think of it as a game of chutes and ladders. If we're not tracking, not just when the door opens, but when it closes again, who gets second chances. And you mentioned SWAs, and this is really important because a lot of the data that we have, SWA is a senior women's administrator, but one of the things that we've seen is it's actually a space where a lot of people get stuck. And I think that that's really interesting. Interesting is not the right word, but that's the word I'm going to use right now. Because what happens is it starts carrying all these kind of notions about that position, right? Our SWAs are going to care for student athletes, and they're going to be responsible for the non-strategic thinking, the non-fundraising, the program directing aspects of athletic administration. And so one of the issues that we're seeing is that a lot of women who are in these initial pipelines because they want to get into athletic administration in various ways are being tracked into SWA positions and then find it very hard to move from there. And so one of the things that we see with the lag in people being able, especially at Power 5 schools, is this notion that nobody, you can't fundraise, you can't manage a college football program, you can't fill in the blank, right? There's always going to be something pulled into that. And so when we talk about pipeline, that initial conversation about access is just the first part of it. Then it becomes who's mentoring you in terms of your upward mobility in it, and are you where you want to be in that track? And I think sometimes we see this too in terms of assistant coaches, right? Who have been assistant coaches for years and years. And I study most often women's college basketball, and I'm just came off of studying the disproportionate lack of Black women head coaches, right, in D1 basketball. And one of the things that you see there is that they are very much at the assistant level, but oftentimes the assistant coaching in terms of recruitment, compliance, academics, right? You're a caretaker. You're not a strategic thinker. You're not the head coach. You're not the person who's going to go sit and recruit in this kind of manner. You're not going to have that competitive drive, but you can take care. And what ends up happening is this huge disproportionate representation in women's college basketball, where you have so many qualified assistant coaches who cannot get a head coaching position. You look at someplace like Arkansas, that literally Coach Satia Messer put that program on the map as a player, was up for a head coaching position multiple times. And in 2 cycles, it went to white men, one of whom had no collegiate coaching experience and coached 1 season of a high school game somewhere, right? And so these are these bottleneck places in the pipeline. Picture it like a garden hose, where you have like the places where it kind of coils up. And I think that the best thing we can do for these conversations about equity is take this long range view and figure out where those coils are, so that we're not sending a bunch of people into a pipeline to only get stuck in a position that some people love to be SWAs. And I think that's wonderful. But there's a lot of people who are SWAs who also want to run some shit. Sorry.
Right.
That's great. Yeah.
No, you're right. I think that same conference, when we finally got the SWAs to the table, there were some schools who had a history professor as the SWA. Well, what does she really know about athletics? You know, so they just, when the position was first created, some of these schools were just taking anybody and giving them that moniker, SWA. So it was okay. They could pigeonhole them because they were providing one by the NCAA, but they weren't really giving that person any role. I mean, I was lucky that I was administering programs, being involved in recruiting, being involved in personnel, hiring, firing, you know, those kind of things. I was lucky not to be pigeonholed, but I've seen others that have been. And she's very right about that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's a great, good imagery for us to kind of understand what's going on in the administration landscape. So thank you, Amira, for that. We have about 10 minutes. So I want to ask kind of final takeaway questions and ask you what you hope that attendees today will take away from this conversation in their position on their campuses. But I also wanted to flag two other things that we didn't quite get to. And that goes back to, Amira, you had mentioned how Title IX has been differently interpreted to protect LGBTQ athletes or not. And it's kind of become this flashpoint in debates about transgender inclusion. So I'm hoping that in someone's takeaway, they can speak to kind of how we get this equitable future that we're hoping that's also inclusive of trans women and gender non-binary athletes. And then Tara, I would love to hear a little bit more specifics of your work in girls flag football kind of as we sign off and wrap up here. So I'll maybe turn it over to Tara to start.
Sure. Definitely would love to talk about girls flag football and could do it for longer than 8 minutes, but I'll keep it short here. Pretty much the beginning for us was realizing that when it comes to high school, there's really no equivalent of boys tackle football for girls. So there are a million more opportunities for boys to play a sport in the fall or the spring, however it is, than girls. So we recognize that, the NFL recognized it, Nike recognized it, and we were just like, how do we provide more opportunities? So the Giants organization has very good relationships with local coaches through the boys programs. And we reached out to one of our coach of the years from a few years back and approached him about this idea for having girls high school flag football in New Jersey. And he was like, fell in love with it, was really our champion to get it done in New Jersey. We started the Shore Conference Girls Flag Football League last year during a pandemic. It kind of came to be just in a few months. And I think that shows the excitement from the girls, the coaches, their families. So we started that league last year. We helped financially, but also would have players come out to just support these girls, let them know that they're really pioneers in the sport. They're doing it for the first time. And while it's not a sanctioned sport yet, it eventually will be. And that is because of what these girls were doing today. And we always ask, like, how many girls have played football before? You get a handful of girls. And we start the clinics and everything, and you can never tell that these girls haven't touched a football because they're watching their brothers do it. They're watching their friends do it. They're watching professional athletes on TV do it. And they just wanted one opportunity to show that they could do it. And I think in their heads, they're just like, wow, I haven't thought of myself as being a football player, but now I am. And providing those opportunities is really important. There are starting to be opportunities at the college level as well. There are professional teams as well. So I think it's just creating that pathway. And we realized that there wasn't an opportunity at high school. So I think if I had to leave everyone here with a few words of encouragement. People are going to tell you no all the time. That's sometimes people's favorite word. They're not going to understand the work that you're putting in. They're not going to see you waking up at 5:30 in the morning, eating breakfast, going to workouts, studying, and going to class, doing the best that you can, working in the community. But you need to understand the value that you have. You need to understand your worth. So when people do tell you no, and you know that something's important, you're going to do everything that you can to pull up the flagpole and make sure that people can see it. Because sometimes it just takes one person seeing it for them to see that they can do it themselves. So I think when it comes to Title IX, understand your worth, understand your value, the platform that you have as a student athlete. Even if you're an administrator, understand that you're really fostering these student athletes into being adults out in the world, and you mean more to them than they know at the time. And it took me a few years to realize that, but just really making sure that you're doing everything you can to help the others around you.
And what we're talking about is access, inclusion, and all of the reasons. Terry, I think it was really beautiful. You talked about what sports provides us, right? And you have to be resilient. Like I think everybody's really sick of being resilient, but it's undeniable that one of the reasons we're all here today is because we understand that there is such immense value in sport, whether you're coming as a fan, as an athlete, as a participant, as a coach, administrator, et cetera. And we know that the ways that the boundaries of sports have been policed have always been to marginalize people. And that is what we're dealing with in another form right now. And a lot of that, again, goes into these gray areas where we can hide behind vagueness and how things should be. But the reality is that sports remains one of the most gender segregated, sex segregated spaces in society. And oftentimes we talk about sports as a reflection of society. And I invite us to think of it as a laboratory for a few reasons that I think that will kind of tie up everything that we've talked about. If we can understand it as a laboratory, we understand the power that sports has to lead the way on a lot of things. In that video that we started with, we talked about how sports and people like Billie Jean King, right, helped the cause of gender equality through sports, how these highly visible things can push the conversation in new ways and doesn't just have to receive it. I think we're seeing that a lot with trans folks in sports in multiple ways. One, it's becoming a kind of cultural war touchstone that we see starts with youth sports bills, which are horrific. And turns into bills that are even more horrific, like here in Texas, where they're going after gender affirming care. They're going after beyond just the athletic fields, but into people's homes, right? Like it's quite scary. And I think that oftentimes when we have these conversations, we do it in these like ways of imagining where we're like, well, this is why this could be destructive. And I always invite us to return to like what's actually happening and this, where the harm and destruction is being felt, and ask us to say, what does it look like if we actually reimagine sports? That's what we do on Burn It All Down all the time. If we burn down, if we say we don't have to accept sports with racism and sexism in it and transphobia in it, we don't have to accept sports with inequality in it. We're all fighting for sports in a more expansive, accessible way. We can do that, right? We can ask questions about why we have these really long held beliefs about ability that makes us gender segregate 5-year-olds. Let me tell you, I spend more mornings than I would like watching Bumblebee soccer where they just all run to the ball. It really doesn't matter. Like literally it's just Bumblebee soccer, right? And yet we're putting these ideas, exactly. But we're putting these ideas into sports very early on. Yes, and that's why I say it's not simply reflecting, right? And so what happens if we take that power that sports has and we ask sports to do better for all of us? And we ask sports to be the place where we can say, hey, this world is not exist on a binary. So how can we have such enforced binaries in sports? Because there are people who are intersex and non-binary, and there's lack of access to sports because of financial reasons. And there's, women have been fighting for sports participation. We have all these things wrapped up together. If we can use our brain power to think about how we provide sport, and sometimes it means upending it, like quite literally. Sometimes it means saying, hey, why aren't there more football opportunities earlier, right? Maybe it's saying, hey, do we want girls playing football? Because we don't want anybody playing football until we deal with CTE, right? Like actually having hard conversations that are sometimes uncomfortable is not easy, but it's something that I invite us all to do, because at the end of the day, it's those uncomfortable conversations that I think help us get to a brighter future. And I'll just end the last point on the analogy I use, which is coming back to celebrating Title IX. And I say that, you know, if you're training for a marathon or you're running, sometimes you want to look back and see how far you've come. And I think that you can do that for a moment, but you can't finish the race facing that direction. But one of the great things about, and sorry, I love sports metaphors, but one of the great things about that stride that you move forward is that I invite you while you do it to nourish yourself. You can't run on fumes. So get resources, get networks, find you a pacer who's going to run with you, right? Where are you intaking water from? What are you reading? What conversations are you having? And the best thing about doing this kind of road race is that it invites people to get off their ass and join you and put one foot in front of the other and continue together to reach that finish line. And so I think that this conversation represents part of that hydration, part of that continued pacing. And I really hope that I see you on the road.
Well, I love the road race and marathon metaphor as a distance runner to close us out, Amira. So thank you. And thank you again to America East for hosting their annual Spread Respect Forum. I'm going to turn it back over to Kate to wrap us up here.
Thanks so much, Val, for moderating a great panel. And thank you to Kathy, Amira, Tara for their wonderful perspectives and expertise in an important conversation. There's so much more to discuss in it. And I too am riddled by sports metaphors. So Amira, thanks for leaving us on one that we can all resonate with as some sort of an athlete, whether you're just a fan or in it day in, day out. So with this, I'd like to just sort of transition out to wrap the day. We have enjoyed 3 really engaging sessions today on the conclusion of day 1 of our Spread Respect Forum. Tomorrow, the forum will continue at 10 a.m. and run through 2 p.m. So come back for tomorrow's theme focuses on highlighting Black professionals in sport. So really important for us to talk directly to our student athlete base and inspire and ignite that group. So we're going to have a number of engaging panelists and sessions. So please join us for tomorrow. And once again, thank you to Val, Kathy, Amira, and Tara for a wonderful way to conclude on day 2. So thanks everybody and have a great afternoon.